Hello everyone. Welcome to the session on building on lessons learned, setting a high bar for the Article 6.4 Supervisory Body. My name is Juliana Kessler. I'm a research associate at Perspectives Climate Research, and my work focuses on the design of market-based instruments, for which I have also been closely following the Article 6.4 Supervisory Body work throughout the last 2 years. Probably you were expecting a different panel, slightly different, but that's the way negotiations go, and that's the risk when you invite Article 6 negotiators into a panel discussion. I still think that we have a very interesting panel and presentations tonight, so I hope you want to stay and hope you want to discuss with us the recommendation on methodologies and removals and the other work that the Article 6.4 Supervisory Body has been doing throughout the last 2 years. Let me give you a quick run through what we're going to present today. So first we will have a presentation from Lambert Schneider from the Oeko Institut, and you already see it in the background on the lessons learned from the Kyoto mechanisms for the Article 6.4 mechanism. Then we will have Axel Michaelowa from Perspectives Climate Research. He will look specifically at the adjustment needs that were identified for 2 CDM methodologies, so ACM 0005 and 006. So Axel is going to go into detail with that. And then we have Jonathan Crook here from Carbon Market Watch, who will provide a deep dive on the recommendation on methodologies and removals and pinpoint some of the issues he sees there or Carbon Market Watch sees there. Afterwards, we exchange the panel. So we're going to have our presenters also as panelists. And with us is Daniel Ortega Pacheco from the ICVCM. And Daniel will also come in on different questions and also bring in the VCM perspective here and there. Okay, with that, Lambert, over to you for the first presentation on lessons learned from the CDM. And welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also a warm welcome from my side. So my presentation presents results from a research project we have been doing with Perspectives and with Infras for the German Environmental Protection Agency on lessons learned from Kyoto mechanisms and also the 2 methodology revisions that Axel will later talk to. So what we did? We looked at what the supervisory body is currently doing. It's in the process of developing new rules for the Article 6.4 mechanism, and parties mandated that the 6.4 mechanism should draw on the lessons learned from the Kyoto mechanisms. And so a key question for the supervisory body is what approaches can be used from the CDM and where should new approaches be developed. And we use this traffic light system to indicate, okay, in these areas we believe that only minor adjustments are needed. We mark that as green. Where substantial adjustments, revisions compared to the CDM should be made by the Article 6.4 supervisory body, we mark that as yellow, and where completely new provisions are needed, we identified that as a red area. And so we went through the main substantive areas that you need to regulate in a carbon market mechanism. So the first is additionality, a well-known concept, that the mitigation activities only happen due to the incentives created from the carbon crediting mechanisms. And so with the CDM, we identified a number of experiences, in particular that very often the assessments are relatively subjective, that there are trade-offs between the robustness and the comprehensiveness and the transaction costs, and also that some positive lists were defined very broad, and so they included some activities where additionality may be unlikely. On the other hand, the CDM introduced a test called prior consideration, meaning that project developers need to make a notification at the investment date or 6 months thereafter that they want to proceed with the registration. And that's something only the gold standard in the voluntary carbon market has implemented. But the other carbon crediting mechanisms like the VCS, the Climate Action Reserve, they all do not require that. And that was an element that we identified to be really important for additionality testing and which should also be taken up by the supervisory body. So we have a number of recommendations that barrier analysis or common practice analysis should not be used as a standalone test, that regulatory surplus should be required and reassessed at appropriate intervals, and that standardization should be used. We have some more recommendations, but that are 3. And the question mark here indicates that I think at this stage it's not completely clear how these 3 issues are addressed by the supervisory body. So if you read the current regulation, I think the use of the barrier analysis, the language is a bit contradictory, and also the other issues will still need to play out in our assessment. Important area, next area is quantification of emission reductions. Here we have heavy reliance on historical data under the CDM. Sometimes data was outdated or not conservative. And a bigger challenge is attributing emission reductions to the mitigation activity. That's a general challenge for carbon crediting mechanisms, that what you quantify as emission reduction really comes from your mitigation activity and not from other effects that occur. And so we identified that it's really important to update methodologies regularly. We couldn't find at first glance a provision that has a determined frequency, and that uncertainty should be assessed systematically. So there is some language on uncertainty in the methodologies guidance, which is also being considered here at the guidance, but it doesn't clearly link the degree of uncertainty to the degree of conservativeness that should be used, etc. So maybe a question mark could also be put here, but there's a red cross, so that's not fully fulfilled. And then there's clear language that the emission reduction should be attributable to the mitigation actions in the proposed guidance from the 6.4 supervisory body. A big area of debate is always non-permanence. So for example, under the CDM, a reversal risk assessment, which is also required now by the supervisory body, was required for CCS, but not for afforestation. And then we have this issue that the Kyoto Protocol ends, and without a proper transition, the non-permanence provisions under the Kyoto Protocol will not last, right? And that's a major loophole because it may simply not be addressed. We had temporary crediting under the CDM, and that was unattractive for many buyers because you have a buyer liability basically to replace units if reversals occur. And then we found that in some areas reversals were not addressed, like for cookstove projects which have a reversal risk. There were no provisions in place to address that risk. So the supervisory body has established or has recommended that a risk assessment is always required, and that also informs how much you need to contribute to a pooled buffer reserve. So there's incentive to reduce risks of reversals. That's something we didn't have under the CDM for afforestation, so that's a good point. But it's not clear for how long you need to monitor actually, right? So there's no clear timeline for that. We will have a pooled buffer reserve that's also used in the voluntary carbon market, but how that will be established and how much will be paid into that, that's not yet clear. And it's also not yet clear whether non-permanence will be addressed for all type of reversal risks. So at least in the initial phase for cookstoves, as I understand it, there will be exemptions, and probably non-permanence for that will be addressed at a later stage. Transparency and project cycle. So this is one of the green areas. I will keep that short. So here the supervisory body took over a lot of elements from the CDM, and here are a lot of elements from the CDM that have worked pretty well. So that, in our view, was a good decision to rely there heavily on the CDM in the project cycle procedure. Validation and verification, a similar result. The CDM has a quite robust accreditation system. Importantly, it also has performance monitoring and sanctions for auditors. And that's also something which we don't observe in the voluntary carbon market. So that's one of the areas where I think the CDM is much more robust than what, how the oversight by auditors and the incentives for auditors work in the voluntary carbon market. But since the beginning of the CDM and also in the voluntary carbon market, there were also concerns about the impartiality of auditors because they are paid by project developers. So one of the recommendations that we actually have is that this choice should be restricted, and there could be different ways of doing that, like a lottery system, etc., but to kind of address this issue of incentives here. And that's a lost opportunity that the supervisory body has not taken up that approach. But otherwise, it has strongly relied on the CDM processes, which is a good thing. We have environmental and social impacts, where the CDM has also a mixed to poor performance, because many of the issues that are now state of the art in the voluntary carbon market and which are required for the supervisory body have not been implemented under the CDM. There was no monitoring of impacts, no grievance mechanism, and also the local stakeholder consultation depended strongly on host country rules, and generally there were no safeguard provisions, right? The only safeguard was that you need a letter of approval from the host country. And so here, hopefully, the 6.4 supervisory body will have more robust and detailed provisions in place, but many of them are still also yet unclear whether they will actually be realized in the process going forward. The one thing that is already adopted is, well, not adopted, needs to be elaborated, but which is clear is that we will have grievance mechanisms. But to what extent safeguards will actually develop, that's not totally clear. There's a mandate to do so from Glasgow, but there's no dedicated work program. It may be done under a tool to report on sustainable development impacts. So to sum up, we also looked into what makes mitigation activities really suitable for the 6.4 mechanism, like what should be credited under the 6.4 mechanism and what not. And we argue that it's important to not just go for the low-hanging fruits, for the really cheap mitigation actions, but also the high-hanging fruits, also to avoid that later, if the cheap reductions are sold, it could be more difficult for the host country to achieve its NDC. Clearly, a new principle is enhancing ambition, and that we should have a high likelihood of additionality. The attributability of the calculated emission reductions, that's a very good signal that that's an explicit principle in the new 6.4 guidelines. And of course, for any projects implemented, it's important that they have positive synergies with other sustainable development objectives, and that they lead to long-term climate benefits, meaning that there's very low risk of reversals, or that it really transforms the economy in the long term. So here are our summary of findings and takeaways. We have, again, the color coding. Overall, we have mixed but very valuable experiences from the CDM, so some points can be really taken over, some need some modifications, and for some it needs quite new, fundamentally new work to really fulfill the requirements under the Article 6.4 mechanism. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lambert. And yeah, now Axel will discuss a little bit whether CDM methodologies could actually be also applied under the 6.4 mechanism, and what would be required, what sort of adjustments would be required for their application to Article 6.4 activities.
Thank you very much, Julie. So we, of course, were looking into the question, what are methodologies that are relevant for the revision under Article 6.4? So we used expert judgment based on the volume of activities that were there in the past, and also, of course, the appropriateness of activity types as per the new principles of the Paris Agreement 6.4 mechanism. And that's why we then chose the following two methodologies: the replacement of clinker in the process of cement production. So for those who are not following in the cement industry every day, there is a very important part of the strength of the cement depends on the so-called additives. And these additives can be either generated through processes that are quite fuel and energy intensive, but there are also alternatives. So for example, fly ash from coal power plants or slag from steel mills can replace that clinker. And of course, if there is stuff that is essentially a waste material and also would generate sustainable development impacts negatively, there are huge piles of this coal power plant dust that pollute the area around these coal power plants. Then you also have sustainable development co-benefits, and this is of course an area that Lambert rightly said the CDM was not so good in actually resolving. And the second methodology we've been looking at is biomass power, the consolidated methodology number 6. Biomass power, of course, is a type of renewable energy that is less prone to additionality challenges compared to wind and solar, because the costs due to technological aspects have not come down in the same way they have come down for solar and wind. And that's why this activity type is still probably additional in most circumstances. And of course, again, it can have significant co-benefits because these residues otherwise can be highly problematic. For example, those who know northern India and come there in the autumn and see the peaks of air pollution that are linked to the burning of crop residues on rice fields know that if you now would burn this under controlled conditions in a good power plant, then you could have significant co-benefits. So those methodologies, of course, as usual under the CDM, make many cross-references to the tools. So for those who are not following this on a daily basis, initially CDM methodologies were mostly standalone, but over the years, as they have been revised, they made more and more cross-reference to overarching tools. And here I've just listed them. I will not enumerate them, but of course an important tool that is used in many methodologies is the calculation of the grid emission factor, which of course is a crucial component. For example, if you, in this context of the clinker replacement, you change processes that relate to electricity consumption, then this grid emission factor is important. And when you look into biomass power, the issue of leakage is very important, because you need to avoid that you just take biomass from some other productive use, and that would then be replaced by, for example, cutting of virgin forests. So it is very important to always look into how are these cross-references to tools being made in the context of CDM methodologies. And as Lambert also said, for the standardization and reduction of transaction costs, tools will play a very important role. So now I just want to go through the different principles that we have under 6.4. Lambert, of course, has described how the CDM fares with regard to the critical principles, but I want to go into some detail here. So with regard to additionality, we have a number of relevant principles there. Under the CDM, there was this so-called E plus, E minus policy that you in the assessment of the baseline and also frequently in the assessment of additionality, would not take into account policies that give incentives for mitigation, which of course is a bit against the purpose. And now, of course, the new additionality definition of the Article 6.4, which clearly refers to the incentives. We need to look at all incentives, not just a subset of them. Then, of course, we have the issue of regulation. Under the CDM, we often had issues that there were laws on the books that are not actually enforced. Now we have a clear statement that we look at the laws on the books and don't address the enforcement ratio, at least the principles say so. Of course, we may see in the different discussions then on the methodology revision and the acceptance of new methodologies, of course, this topic coming up again. Conservativeness, that has been a principle under the CDM, so that's now nothing new. But then we have an important principle that was not visible at all under the CDM, to avoid the lock-in of fossil fuel and emissions-intensive technology. Because under the CDM we had many activities, for example, where you would do boiler refurbishment, or one methodology in which I was myself involved, the use of supercritical coal power plants instead of simple coal power plant technology. So you would, of course, improve the efficiency compared to the baseline, but it would be clear that these new coal power plants would have lifetimes of 30 and 40 years, so they lead to a lock-in. Under CDM, nobody cared about this, but now it's an important principle. Then we look into the quantification of the emission reductions. So a very important new principle is encouraging ambition over time. Lambert has already mentioned it. Of course, the challenge is how to operationalize it. Then the next principle is quite specific, and of course this has generated quite a lot of engagement in the negotiations in the 6.4 Supervisory Body, that the baseline shall be below business as usual for CDM. And well, I've myself done enough CDM methodologies. We always departed from this basic assumption. We want to define as good as possible what is the real business as usual. We didn't want to really now make a differentiation between business as usual and the baseline. Of course, there were some technologies that had been controversial, industrial gases, for example, where actually under the CDM we saw a difference between the business as usual and the baseline, for example, default emission factors for certain chemical gas technologies, but this was only a small subset of CDM methodologies. Then we have the three approaches that are specified, so which is best available technology, benchmarks, or historical emissions adjusted downwards. So there we have a second time the mention of the adjusted downwards, and the methodology shall reflect of one of those approaches. And then again, a very far-reaching principle, if you interpret it in the right way, that you contribute to the achievement of the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement. And that is a principle which is very dear to me. I've tried to do some research on it, proposed what I call the ambition coefficient. Now, of course, there have been many terms in the negotiation, baseline contraction factor, correction factor, and whatever. But the underlying principle would be that in the year 2070, when we need to have net zero or even net negative on a global level, you can't argue that your baseline is a continued emissions intensity of today. There needs to be an adjustment to be in line with the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement. And then, of course, we have the further requirements. Lambert has already mentioned the issue of the reversals and the question of how long it is going to be done, the minimization of the negative environmental and social impacts, and so on. Good. Now getting into our specific methodologies, the ACM5 against clinker from cement plants. So, of course, cement plants can be emissions intensive. For example, there are certain technologies that, the so-called wet technologies, that are inherently less efficient than the dry technologies. They are not used in many places, but still they are used in some places, and of course one should actually get rid of them. And in my view, having such technologies in Article 6.4 projects would mean we lock in emissions-intensive technologies. Of course, what should be an approach to deal with this question? And as we discussed, of course, we don't want now to require every activity developer to make now complicated assessments of what in the specific situation of a plant and a country and the investment characteristics to make a very specific assessment. We thought that it would be appropriate to have a benchmark as a threshold below, well, if the emissions intensity of a cement production plant is higher than that threshold, that this plant would not be eligible to apply the methodology. And we tentatively propose the 0.5 ton CO2 equivalent per ton of cement. We looked, of course, at the distribution curve of emissions intensity of cement plants around the world, and we think that this could be a good starting point for discussion. Then, of course, we have the issue of the question alternative fuel use. We don't want to lock in fossil fuel use by cement plants. So we think there should be a clear incentive to use alternative fuels as much as possible. These alternative fuels would come, for example, from solid waste or old tires. So there is a lot of experience with these alternative fuels in many jurisdictions, so it's not a miracle technology. It's used quite intensively. So again, of course, we don't want to generate a lot of effort for the activity developers, so our suggestion would be to have a threshold for the percentage use of alternative fuels by cement plants, which is 5% more than the average in the specific area, and of course that relates to the cost competitive availability of these fuels there.
Axel?
Of course.
Perhaps we can go through the next slides a bit quicker to also allow for a discussion afterwards.
Then we, of course, have looked at the additionality test, so consideration of all mitigation technology, mitigation policies. Then the uncertainty issues were raised by Lambert, so one needs to assess the uncertainty to which the activity type actually would have a high risk of being non-additional, and we make reference to tools of an initiative called International Initiative for Article 6 Methodology Tools. Actually, I had a short slide presenting the initiative, but it seems not to feature now here in the set. Then when we now come again to the question of the consistency with ambition increase over time. So in the ICM 5 currently there is a standard improvement of the efficiency 2% per year, which is close to the natural trend, essentially business as usual. So this of course is not in line with the ambition criterion. It would have to be increased, and of course we would think that the best available technology approach would be the most appropriate. And of course, I mentioned earlier, we would ask for a Paris goal coefficient that declines over time to reach 0 at the time where we need to globally meet the net zero target. Then, of course, with regard to the monitoring of the negative impacts and the safeguards, one would need new monitoring parameters to reflect those. So with that, I would like to close this presentation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Axel. Then Jonathan will bring us back to the ongoing discussions of within the Article 6 negotiation room. And yeah, you might know that across the last year, the Article 6.4 supervisory body members have been working very hard on a recommendation on methodologies and removals so that the mechanism can actually be operationalized. And Jonathan is going to reflect on, yeah, on your view on how these recommendations uphold.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Jonathan with Carbon Market Watch. Yeah, and as Juliana said, I'll just go through a bit the SB process so far and some reflections on the recommendations. So over the last 1.5 years, just to give a quick overview for those who maybe have not followed this very closely, the supervisory body was already mandated last year to give recommendations to COP27 on 2 particular pieces, so on methodological requirements, which have already been touched on briefly, but regarding baseline setting, additionality, and other core issues, and also on removal activities and how these would feature in Article 6.4. So the methodological requirements piece was not ready by COP because they had only had 3 meetings beforehand, and the removals recommendations were rejected at COP last year because they had some shortcomings, several shortcomings, and were not specific enough and lacked some specificity in several key areas. And so at CMA last year, they gave the same mandate to the SB again for this year, and added on that they should do some more consultations with stakeholders. And so this is what's happened over the last year, meetings 4 through 9, where they worked on these recommendations. So, BAT, ambitious benchmark, and actual historical emissions. So all of these require a downward adjustment, and these adjustments are regularly updated. So it's specified that at each renewal of the crediting period, for instance, this would be updated. And I'll go into a little more detail on that, on some of those aspects in a bit. Additionality, so it's required to have an investment, actually prior consideration, right? So Lambert was speaking to this, the fact that a developer would need to demonstrate that that they'd already considered the carbon credit revenue at the time of the project and not simply later on deciding that there's an opportunity to generate more revenue from credits, but maybe the project doesn't rely on it. So that's missing currently. And then of course, some really key tools are still to be developed over the next year and perhaps beyond, depending on the progress. So for baseline setting, additionality, and leakage. So I mean, in summary, I think there are some good principles certainly in the text and good hooks for future work. Of course, it doesn't guarantee a perfect outcome, right? There's a lot of devil in the details and work to be done in the future, but there are some important good elements in this text. When it comes to removal activities, there are some minimum sort of elements here. So first of all, actually defining a removal, so there's a net removal. That's still a little bit ambiguous, but in principle, one has to deduct any activity emissions, leakage, or reversals, which is important, obviously, to make sure that it's a net removal overall. The risk assessment will be revised every 5 years, or every time after there's been a significant reversal. That's also important. It's sort of a basic minimum element, but it is important that that's there. If there's been a potential reversal, the developer needs to notify this, and there's a 30-day deadline for this. And after that notification, ERs are frozen, so they can't be issued or transferred or used until there's been a subsequent monitoring report that clarifies which reversals have or have not happened, or in case these have been remediated. So that's also important to ensure there's not a large delay for having subsequent monitoring reports. And then, of course, if there is a reversal, this leads to an increased risk rating. So that's also positive. However, coming to the but, there are some issues in this text. There are a number of sort of unclear or open or unresolved and problematic aspects. So first of all, when it comes to the definition, this has not changed a whole lot from last year. And it still leaves openness to perhaps storage and products, or other short-term sites and reservoirs, and there's no minimum sort of durability that has been laid out for permanence. There's also, it's in paragraph 18, there's a clause to essentially stop monitoring after the crediting period. So this would be the developer has to make a request to the supervisory body. And there are two sort of conditions that are, it's an or, so it doesn't have to be both. Either they have to demonstrate evidence that there's negligible risk. In principle, this could be a strong outcome because in practice, most activities probably face more than negligible risk. So in principle, this sounds okay, but the types of evidence that might be accepted are still not described. So will this be sort of peer-reviewed scientific evidence? Will it be other types of evidence which might not be as robust? That's not 100% clear. And then I think the particularly problematic aspect is the second thing, which is that if the project developer addresses remediation, remediates reversals as if they had occurred, and this is based on residual risk rating. As Lambert was speaking to, right, we don't know yet how this risk rating will take place, and this could lead to a poor outcome. If the risk rating is not as high as it should be, then the risk rating will be low. There's also unclear if the residual risk rating will, how that will work. There's really no details on residual risk or if it's just current risk. And if there's a low risk rating, then it means that the developer would be incentivized to essentially take a bit of a discount and never do any monitoring ever again, if that were accepted by the SP. And so you could have situations where monitoring essentially ends immediately after the crediting period or perhaps a few years afterwards, which would not be a good outcome for environmental integrity. There are also no consequences currently if the monitoring simply stops entirely. It's not clear what would happen. Sort of a basic level there would be to assume that there has been reversals for the ERs, unless this is proven otherwise, but this has been deferred to further work. There are also very few details regarding the actual design of the buffer pool and how direct credit replacement will work, which are the two options to address reversals. It's also already been ruled out, so it's already been decided that if this text were adopted, that avoidable reversals need to use direct credit replacement and do not tap into the buffer pool. And the reason why this is not always a good practice is if you can purchase inexpensive credits that maybe are not of as high durability, or from projects maybe that are not additional, depends what criteria they put there, then it doesn't give necessarily a strong incentive for the developer to avoid either poor management or intentional reversals. And so we would have liked that there would be a requirement to draw from the buffer pool and then the developer to replenish the buffer pool fully, so that way it comes directly from their own issuance rather than replacing it with credits that we don't know what credits will be used to replace it. On social and environmental impacts, this is kind of the same sort of weak language, that it's minimize and where possible avoid. So this is all framed in the context of risk management for the developer. It's not really, it's not framed, I think, in a strong way. And in particular, there could have been requirements to demonstrate positive impacts, but that's not been put there. There are also some questions on the host party liability, which I don't think I'll get into in a lot of detail, but some questions raised about, first of all, from an equity perspective, how this risk would be shared, and if it just falls to the host party, if they elect to do this, this could raise also other issues, but I won't get into that actually right now. So essentially, in our perspective, the methodological text, we think it could be adopted at this COP with further guidance, however. So for instance, first of all, requiring there to be sort of prior consideration. And also, there should be a request for the SB and Secretariat to assess the likelihood of additionality of different common activity types, which would inform the development of the additionality tool and the further tests that will come. We don't think that the removals text should be adopted because of various issues that I raised. Yeah, I think they're detailed there, and I think for the sake of time, so we can have some discussion, I won't get into that now. Yeah, these texts do not have to be adopted as a package. They could be separated. That might be politically difficult, but yeah, I'll just end there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan, for sharing your views on both documents that are currently discussed. And we often hear that the Article 6.4 mechanism should be a benchmark of high integrity. And Daniel, you as co-chair of the Integrity Council, so on the Integrity Councils for Voluntary Carbon Market Expert Panel, what would you say? How can the different international regulatory bodies really contribute to high integrity?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for this kind of invitation. It's always a privilege to share a panel with such a distinguished colleagues. First, a few remarks on my side. We need to understand that when we talk about the SB, we are talking about an implementation mechanism. The CDM was also an implementation mechanism for a different accord. So when I like to think about these implementation mechanisms and what we do in the voluntary carbon market, we try to think that these mechanisms, they need to be fit for purpose. How we ensure that is perhaps through regulation, and what the Integrity Council does is a more self-regulatory approach. And I like to speak to that, the different nature and the roles that we have, right? So what the ICBCM does, first of all, is an independent governing body of the voluntary carbon market with the aim, with the mandate to facilitate the identification of high integrity. We do this by evaluating carbon crediting programs and by evaluating categories, which is a mix of types and credit types. What we have tried to put together is a rule book that will give us the opportunity to do the assessment, and that's how we came out with the core carbon principles that essentially put together the conditions under which high integrity can be built. Our theory of change is very simple. If we introduce integrity, we will hope the scale will come to us. So the fit for purpose comes down to, on the one hand, facilitating the implementation of the Paris Agreement, right? Because we facilitate access to private finance that would otherwise not occur, and to accelerate that climate action. Whereas the SB, at the end of the day, is the implementation mechanism in itself, right? So we will be evaluating carbon crediting programs. In this case, in the voluntary carbon market, you have BERA, you have gold standard, and you have others. So let us just have that clear differentiation, right? What the Integrity Council does, it works and operates on the voluntary carbon market. It's a self-regulatory approach. And we will be evaluating programs, carbon crediting programs, like the Subsidiary Body 6.4. So under that differentiation, I like to think that the Integrity Council does not only look at the quality characteristics of the credit, but also the quality of the programs themselves. So how decisions are made, how standards are developed, and whether the governing bodies of those carbon crediting programs, they align to some specific rules of management of conflict of interest, right? Whether they develop participatory approaches with external inputs to develop their methodologies. Those are, let's say, functions that the SB will not have. But where we find each other in this joint effort is to build integrity. Whether it's in the voluntary carbon market or the regulated one, that's one central characteristic. And when we think about the credits, you may think about the fungibility of it, which is the reason that we want to have specific characteristics independent of where they operate, whether it's regulated or not. That quality characteristic should be there. We would like to see as well some interoperability, right? So in the voluntary carbon market, if we ensure that high integrity, perhaps in the future, these credits, whether under SB or whether in the voluntary carbon market, could be taken by the market. What we'd like to see perhaps is that increased fungibility or ensuring fungibility will also deliver high liquidity, and that's how the finance will be scaled up. So yes, coming back to these related characteristics, is that we have focused so far in efforts that look at sustainable development and safeguards too. And we understand that there are learning opportunities on the work that we do. So we have been able to learn from CORSIA. We have take the process that CORSIA has done, and we will hope that we can continue to learn what the SB is doing, for instance, with sustainable development tool. So we see that each other we can complement in a few view of ecosystem of integrity. So perhaps that's for my initial remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing these insights into ICVCM's work and also into on your comment that it can all be complementary as well, in that sense, in that we can learn from each other and that different mechanisms could learn from each other. Perhaps to a question that might interest the majority of people in this room, to you, Lambert and Jonathan, where are we currently standing in the Article 6 negotiations regarding the approval of the recommendation on methodologies and removals? Perhaps Lambert, you can go first.
Yeah, thank you. So, we had an interesting exchange, in particular today, in the negotiations on the recommendations from the Supervisory Body, and I think many parties acknowledged the work that was done, and that there are a lot of improvements compared to what we saw last year, and also that the process was more inclusive with a lot of calls of inputs, etc. But I would say the general sentiment was more positive to the methodologies guidance than to the removals guidance. Some parties seemed to be ready to accept both documents, but in particular on the removal guidance, a number of parties expressed concerns and signaled that further work would be necessary before the guidance could become applicable. Of course, that raises the question, what does that mean for the process? Does that mean the Supervisory Body needs to work on that and come back a year later and then the CMA approves, or would there be maybe different ways giving the Supervisory Body a mandate to revise and then at some stage it becomes operational without going back to the CMA? So these are questions which were not yet really addressed, but which are implicitly, of course, on the table. And then the question is, will the parties be able to kind of agree on the areas where improvements are necessary? So I think it's an impossible task to negotiate the recommendation and to revise it in the negotiation room and adopt a revised guidance. But I think a more likely outcome could be that the decision which is taken here gives specific guidance to the Supervisory Body on the areas where further work or revisions are necessary. So that's my personal reflection from where we stand and what a possible outcome could be.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't have actually so much to add. That's a very good summary. I think as well, yes, parties are reluctant to reopen the text directly, which I also can understand, because I think there can be considerable risks also with reopening the text that could weaken perhaps both of them.
Tools that are not yet developed, and also here and there it doesn't provide clear definitions. So what does this imply for the approval of specific methodologies? What do you think?
We've seen in the past, in the context of CDM, that methodologies could improve over time. So we have had certain methodologies that have been revised 20 or even more times. So I would hope that we'll have this learning regulatory system now also in the context of Article 6.4. Of course, what would be important to ensure that the first few methodologies newly approved are good examples, because then actually now triggering the use of that expertise. But I think it could be an extremely useful approach now to harness the expertise and not just push the general submissions, because to be very frank, yeah, if the experts now all work free of charge on these public comments, yeah, this is not incentive compatible. So there needs to be an approach to harness the expertise that exists and bring it in. And of course, we, through our international initiative on Article 6 methodology tools, have tried to actually provide such expertise and input. And of course, we are happy to see that some of it and some important parts of it have actually been reflected now in the draft guidance.
Yeah, thank you. And indeed, some parties definitely brought up that the expert panel should play a larger role in the next year as well. So there is this call for involving experts from some parties. Yeah, the SB is also planning for a sustainable development tool, as we have heard, and there is the mandate to develop environmental and social safeguards. How, Daniel, what approach has the ICVCM chosen here? And do you think that the safeguards can also be addressed through the development of a sustainable development tool? What approach has the ICVCM chosen here?
Okay, so well, in my first intervention, I established the different nature and complementarities that we can have. I should point out that in many of the markets, soft regulation will also perhaps contribute or stimulate improvement in the regulatory body. We have received very positive news during the COP, such as that the Commodity Futures Trading Commission of the United States has followed our principles for integrity. So we also believe that from the self-regulatory perspective and from the private sector, there can be information flow towards discussion on the regulatory bodies. And perhaps some jurisdictions like Singapore, they have also indicated what are the characteristics both of the crediting programs that they will be using, but also in terms of the quality principles that are looking at. So keeping this in mind, when you look at the rule book of the Integrity Council, we have introduced not only the principles at the program level that needs to be followed, as I indicated with respect to the governance, the management of conflict of interest, how decisions are made, etc., but also with respect to the transparency and the management of the registries. We have also introduced some of the areas that were valuable from the CDM, for instance, sanctions with respect to validation and verification bodies so that they can perform well. We have adopted that now on the voluntary carbon market, perhaps correcting what Lambert indicated in his initial intervention. And what we also noticed is that back in the time CDM didn't introduce the safeguards, or whether or not reporting on sustainable development contributions were necessary. So the rule book of the ICVCM now introduces that. We perhaps introduce it in a way that we also understand that as you strive to achieve higher quality, higher cost will also be in place. So try to minimize that. We have enabled 4 carbon credit programs for them to conduct a bottom-up approach on how they would like to manage safeguards and sustainable development. We have observed that as part of the discussions relative to sustainable development tool, the Secretariat has synthesized and has made a very good summary of what is the benchmark practices across carbon crediting programs. They have submitted a request for inputs to understand whether different stakeholders will value this approach from a bottom-up context or whether they would like to have a top-down approach. And so we will continue to observe the discussions under Article 6.4 to learn what will be the landing area. What we have done as the Integrity Council, I would say, is that we have taken on board a risk-based approach. And hopefully down the road, we can contribute to standardizing how carbon crediting programs can do it and how carbon crediting programs can guide project developers on doing it. Just to give you an example. So right now, if this 6.4 body adopts the tool and the tools bring some safeguards, it has a very long list of safeguards, even longer than ours. It includes to check on the overall climate impact. We don't have that. We do have the need to provide incentives for not locking in transitions. How that translates on how carbon crediting programs will guide that, we don't know. But when we look at other experiences in different markets, how you manage that risk, if you need to identify the likelihood of the risk occurring, right? And the second, also understand the severity of it. So one way to standardize that would be to introduce some, given expert consultations, identify what are the parameters that can guide that assessment by the project developer so that the carbon credit program can go about checking and the validation and verification body can come and cross-check. So that's a pending area of work. We would really like to see how that is deployed under Article 6.4, but it's the same for sustainable development, right? So we need to ensure in terms of parameters and standardizing how that is done, we need to ensure first that these are net positive contributions, that they can be direct attribution, right? What is the magnitude expected of this type of impacts and what is the duration of it? So perhaps what we have learned in the other characteristics, now we need to revisit with respect to sustainable development impacts and safeguards in a way that is manageable. What I will see, I finally, and we close with this on a personal basis, is that if we can ensure to deliver on this area, the carbon credit is not only fit for purpose for the climate agreement and to mobilize private finance additional, right? But it's also compatible with the notion of impact finance. And when that happens, when we achieve that marriage, we are really talking about finance at a scale, given the rush that is now for governments to issue a structured debt using sustainable linked bonds. The performance of those instruments will really benefit on using carbon credits, given that carbon credit is the only available asset at this point of time that is third-party verified. Anything on sustainable finance, whatever is taking place with green bonds, that is not third-party verified. They only have second-party opinions that are not binding. So linking these two instruments, I would say, will really contribute to the climate discussions.
Thank you very much for these elaborations. So I guess the working group of the supervisory body still has some work to do in this direction as well. And we also need to they also need to actually operationalize a grievance mechanism. And Jonathan, would you like to share any considerations what such a grievance mechanism should take into account?
Yeah, I think first of all, for both the Sustainable Development Tool and the grievance mechanism that are mandated, I think of course these need to not be rushed, and there needs to be proper time taken into developing these two crucial aspects. I think in particular there needs to be consultations that are rigorous with indigenous peoples and local communities who are perhaps likely to be potentially the most impacted by these projects. And I think there needs to be more clarity on how that will be conducted in the coming year. And again, if it's too short a time, this can also be pushed further. I think it's really crucial, and actually many parties spoke to this when discussing the recommendations, that a grievance mechanism that's operational and independent is set up, as well as a sustainable development tool, before any projects are registered and are issuing credits. This is really a prerequisite. And if it takes time to do it, that needs to happen. So this is something that really, I think, first of all, cannot be rushed. And speaking to that, there was a public consultation that was launched just before COP for about 4 weeks. And I think the goal is to finish these tools in the next, I think by not the next SB meeting, but the one after that. But the time frame to provide comments was right before COP, when many stakeholders who might have inputs on this process are occupied with preparing for COP, going to COP, etc. And so this is really, I don't think, is not a good way to do this, because there's probably not going to be as much input as they would have had. So would call, first of all, for there to be renewed consultations for a longer period of time, starting next year. And again, just really stress that this needs to take the time that it takes to develop this in a good way. And we see, of course, there are many issues we see on the voluntary market and allegations these days with several projects. And so this is not just a minor issue. This is really a fundamental problem that needs to be addressed and managed well. So, and that includes, ensuring that safeguards are preventative, and that it's not just framed in a way of minimizing risk for the project developer, which is often how it's framed on the voluntary market. Minimizing risk for the developer and making their lives sometimes a little bit easier, when I think it really needs to be framed in ensuring that there's proper consultation, free, prior, informed consent, and many other issues. So I think, yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. I think with that we would like to open up for a little bit of a discussion. I see some methodology developers in the room as well. Yeah, please come forward if you have a question, raise your hand, and I usually will pass on the microphone. Somebody here to break the ice? Yeah, please. And great if you can also state your name and the organization you're from, and perhaps to whom you would like to direct your question to.
Yeah, thank you. Very great panelists to hear. I follow Article 6, but I'm a project developer myself. My name is Diagne. I work for Fauna and Flora. It's not a question actually, just a thought, and I would like to hear the panelists' view. So, because we have been hearing quite clearly now that Article 6.4 will not be kind of recognizing the voluntary carbon market standards and methodologies, which actually as ICVCN is kind of also reviewing and kind of making it more, improving it and kind of making it at par with the CDM methodologies. And I feel that this could slowly kind of drive away the project developers from the voluntary carbon market towards Article 6. Because why develop, why use VCS when we have 6.4, which could be, if you use the methodology, it could go to both 6.2 and 6.4. So that is the basis, like kind of, we are all talking about like converging the VCS and Article 6, but at one point we are kind of saying no, as of now, we wouldn't be recognizing the VCS standards and methodologies, but only CDM. So kind of, do you think that this is kind of a right way of, because we need everything now to make sure that we have faster projects on the ground. For example, I develop forestry projects. Forests are disappearing very fast, and we need to have very fast projects on the ground. We need to make sure that the money gets to the communities. But now, like, it's just my thought, like, I might be wrong. So that's my, just would like to give you, get your view on from your panelists. And another question is, I might have missed them. I saw in one of your slides saying that the supervisory body kind of now looking into revising the CDM methodologies. That is something I have not heard about, because the text I have read just said that the CDM, the supervisory body, will be looking into methodologies. It has to be approved by the supervisory body, but I've never read that they are looking at CDM methodologies. So I don't know where, maybe I missed that, or I'd like to know where that came from. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps Axel, yes.
Well, of course, we've seen in the voluntary carbon market a much wider range of methodologies than we saw under the CDM. Of course, CDM didn't accept avoided deforestation, so it's clear that the voluntary carbon market took the lead in developing such methodologies. Of course, there has been a lot of controversy on such methodologies, so some relevant voluntary carbon market standards now have improved their methodology. I see Vera methodology coming out very recently. So of course, in principle, one could look at those methodologies applying the same criteria that we have done here. So I think the work of the voluntary carbon market community is valuable, but of course it has to pass the same level of scrutiny than the CDM methodologies. And I would think that probably a higher share of voluntary carbon market methodology doesn't fulfill the principles of 6.4 than of the CDM methodologies. But yeah, there should be an attempt to bring in the best which has been developed over the past 20 years. And of course, the voluntary carbon market developers for certain technologies have good methodologies. So yeah, we shouldn't exclude this from the process immediately, but yeah, we should scrutinize them according to the same standards.
Yeah, Jonathan.
I would just briefly add, if the methodological requirements text, for instance, is adopted and there are downward adjustments under Article 6.4, I think it raises questions that this should be done under the voluntary market. And similarly, right, there is 2% OMGE, which, you know, could have been higher, but there is this required under 6.4. same thing, share proceeds for adaptation. I think there are some very legitimate questions as to why that wouldn't apply also to the voluntary market. So yeah, I think it's a two-way street as well. So yeah.
Yes, we have another question.
Yes, Nathan Abatza, NDC facility. I have a specific question on non-permanence. I was wondering, it's maybe a technical question that's due to the fact that I haven't been following in detail the technical discussions, but in terms of non-permanence, I'm seeing you're considering now the buffer pool strategy, I would say, or approach to address permanence. And I was wondering if at some point the 10-year approach the 10-year accounting was a possibility.
Lambert, do you want to answer this question first, and then Axel can perhaps add?
Yeah, so 10-year accounting was actually considered by the supervisory body. So there was an input prepared by the UNFCCC Secretariat on 10-year accounting as an approach. And then there were several submissions questioning the science behind it, right? Because I think the issue is that taking CO2 out of the atmosphere for 10 years doesn't have an equivalence. You cannot calculate an equivalent for taking it out for 100 years, because the atmosphere is like a cumulative budget, right? And any reversal that occurs in is to be taken out of the atmosphere again to stay on the same temperature path, right? And so that's an underlying science issue where equivalence to fossil fuel emissions. And I think that was, in my understanding, there were several submissions on that, and that was the reason why there was an active decision by the supervisory body. At some point it's reflected in the meeting report that 10-year accounting will no longer be considered.
10-year accounting has been subject of a lot of scientific articles in the early 2000s that came to different conclusions. A critical aspect there is 10-year accounting makes sense if you buy time and you get a backstop technology. What is a backstop technology? A backstop technology would be a technology that can take out an unlimited amount of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere at a certain level of cost. That's of course a huge assumption. Some people believe direct air capture could become such a backstop technology, but of course it's a wild guess. At the current stage we have 10,000 tons of direct air capture per year in commercially viable, or at least technically proven approaches with long-term storage. And of course, this relates a bit to what also Jonathan was saying. If the removals guidelines now accept temporary storage in products, this is the same concept. If you keep, for example, the carbon in wood that's used for housing, and the houses on average have it's the same idea, because it could then lead to the classical phenomena of mitigation.
Further questions? Yes, Jörg here up front.
Thank you. My name is Jörg Füßler from INFRANS in Switzerland, and I would like to go to the topic of Paris alignment, maybe also as examples how the different approaches that we see right now maybe converge or diverge. And we have the Paris alignment would mean that, in contrast to the situation in the CDM now, with most countries having NDCs, so mitigation targets, the baseline would need to reflect that fact, and there solutions have been proposed, like the Axel factor or convergence factor, whatever you want to call it. And I think in the voluntary really implemented. It is part of a work program in ICBCM. We see it in 6.2, with some countries in 6.2. We have all these different streams which are a bit different, or the same. My question would be, how do you see that? Will 6.4 be a forerunner to implement that, or where do you see which stream will be more advanced, which may more be lagging behind in this question?
Any volunteers for this question? Diagne, you want to go first?
Briefly. Well, the first, our rulebook at the Integrity Council does require that programs have a grievance mechanism. So we were really looking forward to alignment would take place. It introduces the need to discuss and further define rules for how we align from the voluntary carbon market with respect to corresponding adjustments. It has to do also with share of proceeds. So we see the Paris alignment in broader perspective, right? And hopefully down the road there will be opportunities, and I would like to invite you to be part of these continuous improvement work programs.
Yeah, thank you. Axel, very briefly.
Well, we can have a race to the top if we have frontrunners, and I would think, for example, Switzerland, Article 6.2 pioneer.
On the other hand, you have Article 6.4 especially, building up on CDM with a, partly, admittedly, a very rigid set of rules. My question, which is a bit vague, is how could having good governance supplement, or could you come up with a system with a more or less relaxed set of rules, but with a good governance, which could possibly navigate you through an uncertain future with a huge change? Thanks. Sorry for the vague question. Thank you.
Very difficult question.
For the second time.
Daniel, you would like to add something?
Very succinctly, I wholeheartedly support what Axel has indicated, but two reflections. First, there are examples in other markets where self-regulating exercises have been uptaken on jurisdictional approaches, and that become regulation. To give you an example, the Task Force on Climate Disclosure now is being taken by several regulating bodies. So what will happen is that if jurisdictions, because some jurisdictions are now developing their own crediting mechanisms, right? So the SB will be there. Some countries will decide to set up their own markets. What I would suggest is that we should strive to achieve interoperability. And any rulemaking associated with governance that facilitates that interoperability, that should contribute to the overall climate goal by scaling the market.
Yeah, thank you. I guess with this, I would like to close the event, and I would like